See? Told you not to hire a professional.
Why not? Let's do the quadruple chili cheese dog with extra beans.
Yeah, feels stable.
Merry Christmas, buddy.
I think we should invest in this timeshare.
I'd like to buy a cat.
Looks good.
Hey. It is great to be back here. I love this church, and I can't believe it's been almost 25 years ago that we began this journey of starting a real-life church. It's especially fun for me to be here this weekend because you got to hear last week about the announcement of Jake becoming your new senior pastor. I love Jake. I'm excited for what God has done, but I'm so excited for what God is going to do. It got me reminiscing, partly because I'm staying at the Hyatt in Valencia, which is where we had some of our initial interest meetings. Like before this church actually started, we gathered together some small groups of people and talked to them about this vision for real life. And so on Thursday, I pulled up a document from 25 almost years ago that I read at the Hyatt there when we were just about ready to start this church, and I was trying to encourage people to be a part of it. I just want to read to you a little of what I said then. Somewhere today, there's a man from another state who's just accepted a job in Santa Clarita. His family's a mess. His priorities are out of whack. Heaven is not his home, but because of God using this church, his life will change. There's a single mom in this valley who's tired, and she's unsure where she will find the strength to keep going, but at this church, she will find help and she will find hope. There's a couple who recently moved here and has no community. Their marriage is struggling, but one of you will invite her to this new church and she will discover people who will love her and care for her. There's a man who lives for the next drink. He's lost control of his life, spinning, ready to crash, but in desperation, he will come to this new church and he will find the power in Jesus to take back his life. Somewhere in this valley, a student is starting to give up, not sure if this life is worth living. He would have become another suicide statistic, but at this church, he will find Jesus. Somewhere in this valley, there's a woman who is lonely, feels like she'll never be chosen, but she will come to this church and discover that Jesus has chosen her and real life is found in him. Somewhere today is a man who's thinking about leaving his wife and kids, about ready to take a path he will forever regret, but he too will come to this church and Jesus will help him be the husband his wife has prayed for and the father his kids desperately need. And then I said in that room, and maybe some of you want to be a part of that. And here we are 25 years later and just having the opportunity to see what God has done. And it's only what God can do. In fact, what I want to do is just a way to give God glory for what he's done the past 25 years. As I would love to ask you to testify to some of this. So this might be a little uncomfortable for some of you, but when you do this, it's a way of glorifying God. It's a way of honoring him. So here's what I'd like to do. I'm going to read some statements, and if it applies to you, then if you would just stand up. Would you stand up if you expressed your faith in Jesus and you were baptized at this church? Would you stand up if that's true for you? That is awesome. That's incredible. You can be seated. Would you stand up if this church helped your children learn to love Jesus? Stand up if that's true for you. Some of you are doing calisthenics. That's okay. A little up and down. That's awesome. You can be seated. Would you stand up? And this one's a little harder, but I know some of you have the humility and courage to just recognize how God has used this church to help you in this area. Would you stand up if this church has helped you overcome an addiction? If that's true for you, would you stand up? Awesome. That's awesome. Thank you. Would you stand up if this church has helped save your marriage? If that's true for you? Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I love that. Stand up together. Thank you all. That's beautiful. Would you stand up if this church has helped you find hope during a time of grieving in your life? Okay. Yeah, you can stay standing. Stay standing. Would you stand up if this church has helped you fight against depression and anxiety? If that's true for you, would you stand up? Awesome. You can stay standing. Would you stand up if God has used this church to help you overcome anger and bitterness, forgiving yourself, forgiving someone else in your life? And if you haven't already, would you stand up if this church has helped deepen your relationship with Jesus? If that's true for you, would you stand up? All right. You can be seated. I just want us to recognize what God has done, and what I hope that does is give us an anticipation of what he will do. In Isaiah, God speaks through his prophet, and he says to his people, I want you to forget about the old things. I want you to forget about the former things, because I'm going to do something new. And when you read that passage, you might think to yourself, well, that's about forgetting your past, like the negative stuff, the sinful things, the mistakes, the failures, the regrets. You got to put those behind you so God can do something new. And while that's certainly a biblical idea, that's not the context of Isaiah. Instead, God reminds his people all the great ways he has worked, and then says, okay, forget about those things because I want to do something new. Don't just hold me to what I've done, because I'm just now getting started. And I think that's true as we celebrate what God has done in this church. I think it's only the beginning. And what he wants to do is unite us around an expectation of what he's going to do next, so that we have this childlike faith that says, God, thank you for what you've done, but thank you for what you're going to do. When my son, who's 19 now, was like 8 or 9 years old, he was going with me on his first preaching trip. Like, my daughters would go with me, take turns when I would travel and speak one at a time. They'd go. It was finally my son's turn. He was so excited the night before about it, and so he kept calling me into his room, asking me about it, and I was getting frustrated, like, just go to bed, bro. And he called me again. I went in there, and I'm like, hey, it's time for bed. You got to go to sleep. And he said, okay. But Dad, I just want to thank you for tomorrow. I just want to say thank you for tomorrow. And that's the kind of faith I think God as a father wants us to have, where we say, God, here's how much confidence I have in what you're going to do. Is I'm going to thank you in advance for what's going to happen. And so we look to the past, we celebrate, look what God has done. We have expectant faith about what God is going to do. And I just believe that the best is ahead for this church. So excited about what God has done and what he's going to do. I think about the people 25 years from now that will stand up because of your commitment to this church, because of your serving this church, your generosity to this church, your faithfulness. Like, God is going to use all of that, and there'll be all new people that would stand up 25 years from now. We're starting this series this weekend called No Regerts. And when I saw the title of it, like, I immediately knew what it was a reference to. You remember the tattoo picture that went around some years ago on the internet, where the guy went in, presumably to get the tattoo of no regrets, but it was no regerts. And I don't know exactly what that moment was like for that man. I think he walked into that tattoo shop and he had had enough, right? Like, he was ready for a new day. He was ready to declare things are going to be different for me from now on. He wanted to say to himself and to the whole world, from this day forward, I'm going to live with no regrets. Like, that was his heart. And yet, it didn't quite go as planned, and tattoos stick with you. Maybe your regret story is a tattoo story. I've got one. I go into a tattoo shop to get a wedding ring tattoo. I kept losing my wedding ring, and so I thought, I'm just going to tattoo something on there. I get done getting this tattoo, and the guy who's giving me the tattoo says, hey, nobody's here. If you want to get another tattoo, I'll give you a good deal on one. And I had not prepared myself for this scenario. I'm like, how good a deal are we talking about? He said, I'll give you an incredible deal. So now it suddenly felt like poor stewardship not to do it, right? Like, it just seemed like the right thing. And I'd been reading the Song of Solomon, and in Song of Solomon chapter 8, verse 6, Solomon speaks to his bride and says, I've placed your name like a seal over my heart. I'm like, that is so romantic. If I put my wife's name on my chest as a seal of love, like, if I did that, like, that grand gesture, that romantic, it would be more than she could resist. I'm just playing this out in my mind. I'm like, let's put my wife's name on my chest. But she's got a long name, and Desiree is her name. So I'm like, let's just do Desi. And that's what I call her anyway. So I thought, that's what we'll do. And so he shaves the hair like a square on my chest. It's getting a little irritated and inflamed, and he starts tattooing it on there. And I'm okay, because I'm just thinking of the big reveal, what that moment's going to be like when she sees it and just, can't contain herself. And so I get this tattoo. I go home that night. I'm waiting for the kids to get in bed, fall asleep, but I've got it all planned. Like, I've got candles in the bedroom. I've got John Legend playing in the background. She walks in to the room. I take off my shirt. She sees the tattoo. And in 20 years of marriage, I have never seen her laugh so hard for so long. Right? Like, instant regret. I'm like, this is not what I was expecting. And tattoos, they stick with you, they mark you, you can't get rid of them, they follow you around wherever you go. And a lot of regrets are like that in life. Like, they just don't seem to go away. We can't seem to shake them. And one of the regrets I want to talk to you about this morning is this: I regret being so busy. Now, you hear that and you might think, well, that doesn't seem like that significant of a regret, but what I would tell you is that busyness is often what leads to so many other things that we regret. So many broken relationships, so much poor health. Like, at the root of so much of it is this busyness, not living with the rhythm of rest that the Bible would teach us to live with. Business Weekly did an article some time ago where they asked people in the business world, how would you answer this question? How are you feeling, or how are you? And they said the number one answer was something along the lines of, I'm so busy. I'm crazy busy. It's a busy season. I've just got more to do than I can handle right now. Like, that is our constant state of just, it's busy. And we think things will slow down, but they rarely do. And we end up living with a lot of other regrets. But at the foundation of those regrets is really this busyness. That's really where it's rooted in. And what we know now, of course, is that so much of depression and anxiety and irritability and just broken relationships can be connected to not resting well. CNN did a report on a study that showed that people who regularly work 11-hour days are 250% more likely to become clinically depressed. Dr. Susan Coven practices internal medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, wrote in an article, in the past few years, I've observed an epidemic of sorts, patient after patient suffering from the same condition. The symptoms of this condition include fatigue, irritability, insomnia, anxiety, headaches, heartburn, bowel disturbances, back pain, and weight gain. And there are no blood tests or x-rays to show this condition, but it's easy to recognize the condition, she says, is excessive busyness. And busyness promises productivity, but almost always at the expense of connection with other people. Busyness promises accomplishment, but robs us of significance. Busyness promises fulfillment, but leaves us feeling empty. Busyness seems like a path that will lead to no regrets. This is one of the reasons why this one's so slippery, is because we think, if I stay busy enough, I'll live a no-regret kind of life, when in reality, busyness, excessive busyness, life out of balance, life with no rhythm, leads to all kinds of regrets. And so I want us to just look at some verses from Genesis chapter 1, where God establishes this rhythm for our lives. If you take Genesis 1, the creation account, and you look at the rhythm of nature, creation, it helps us understand some lanes that we should be living our life in. So let's start in Genesis 1. And listen for the rhythm here. Verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Verse 6 and 7 talk about God creating the sky and the water, and verse 8 says, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. God creates all kinds of vegetation. Verse 13, and there was evening and there was morning the third day. God creates day and night and sun and moon. Verse 19, and there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. God creates fish, fills the water with fish and fills the sky with birds. Verse 23, and there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. On the sixth day, God creates the land animals, and then he creates man. Verse 31, and there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. And then on day 7, we read in chapter 2, verse 3, God rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So there's this rhythm to it. Think of it like a rap or a spoken word piece where there's this hook that keeps coming in, that draws your attention. It's what keeps the rhythm of it. And there was evening and there was morning, and there was evening and there was morning, and then 3 times, and God rested and God rested and God rested. And there's this rhythm that's built into creation, and the Hebrew calendar was built around the rhythm of creation and the rhythm of nature. Here's a picture of what the Hebrew calendar might have looked like. Its simplicity is what should probably stand out to us the most. What I want you to see is how they roughly carved out their day. There were just very distinct boundaries with how they were giving their time and what they were giving their attention to. Of course, they weren't wearing watches. They're going by the sun, but here's where we would kind of frame up their calendar. From 6 p.m. to around 9 to 10 p.m. was committed to relationships and connecting. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. was sleep. From 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. was committed to work and productivity, not just like the job, but getting things done that needed to be taken care of. And so this was the rhythm, just very distinct lanes for their time. Lots of boundaries in place. And what I want to draw your attention to is first the fact that it was evening and then it was morning, that their day started at 6 p.m., not 6 a.m. You think, well, does that really matter? I think something significant happens if you think of your day as beginning when you come home from work. Like you think, this is the start of my day. I'm not going to walk into my house and give my family the leftovers, right? Like I'm not going to just go home, lay on the couch, and scroll through my phone. Like this is my day is beginning now. It's starting, and I'm going to give my best to the people in my life. I'm going to give my best to my relationships and to connecting with others. And so they had these boundaries that were built in. And there were times for producing, being productive, and then there were times for connecting. And what many of us do is we just allow those things to overlap, and it gets unhealthy quick. There was a convicting moment for me on this when my kids were younger. We were playing charades as a family. Don't judge us for that, but it was a quiet night. And my daughter, Morgan, probably middle school at the time, she pulls out a piece of paper from the hat. She's supposed to act out whatever it says on that piece of paper. And here's what she did. She acted like she was opening a computer, typing on the computer. And when she did that, everybody said, "Dad." Like that was how they imitated me, working on my computer. Coming home, I just got to get some things taken care of. Opening it up, sitting on the couch, working on my computer, there but not really there. And this is how we tend to live our lives. Our phones have added to this, of course, where we are constantly checking, always looking. Like our phones are always calling our names, always distracted. And so for the Hebrews, they had these calendars based on creation that gave them some distinct lanes. And then God required his people to live with these rhythms. First, there was a daily rhythm. Morning and evening, and then before meals, they would pause. They'd take a breath. They would speak a prayer of gratitude. And I would just challenge you to do this. In the mornings and in the evenings and before your meals, you would just take a breath. You would pause. You would express your thanksgiving to God. You'd recognize his provision and care for you. When you're busy, the first thing to go is often gratitude. When we want to implement rest into our lives, we carve out some time to be thankful, to pay attention to God's hand in our lives, to recognize our dependence on him and his provision for us. But it's hard for us to do that because when you're going at a certain speed, you don't recognize that you're really going that fast, right? Like when you're always going fast, it doesn't seem that fast. But when my son turned 16, I put the Life 360 app on his phone. How many of you are familiar with that? Parents? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's good. If you're not, you probably should be familiar with it if you got teenagers. But it shows you the route that they drive, and it shows you how fast they drove to get there. And then it gives you a report at the end of the week, and on this report, it shows the high speeds and then the route they took when they were going that fast. And so I get his report when he's 16, and it says 93 miles an hour on one of these routes, which I know for some of you out here, you're like, but it was a big deal, right? It was a big deal for us. And so I sit him down, and I say to him, hey, buddy, you're going to have to explain this to me. And he looks at my phone, sees on the app, looks at the route, sees 93 miles an hour, and I'm like, can you explain that to me? And he's like, oh, I remember this. And then he looked at me and he said, but I'm surprised you don't. I'm like, well, why would I remember this? And he's like, you were the one who was driving. And he was right. Like, I thought, oh, that's right. He was the passenger on that particular day. And what we tend to do is we get in this daily speed where we might recognize the people around us, like people are going by us, they're passing us, and we're thinking, man, those people are moving. They're going, but we're not really paying attention to our speed. We're not really looking at our rhythm. We recognize other people going too fast, but we don't slow down enough to see how fast we're going. We think about those who are passing us, but we're not really paying attention to all the people that we pass. And so these daily rhythms, morning and evening and before meals, they cause us to slow down, to give our attention to God, fill our hearts with gratitude, to live with a daily awareness. God also required his people to live with weekly rhythms, a Sabbath, where one day a week it would be a time for reflection, it would be a time for renewal. It's not just, Sabbath isn't just, binge watching a show on Netflix all day. That is often more exhausting. The question is, are you doing something that reconnects you with God and replenishes you? It's a time of renewal, it's a time of reflection. And then God established yearly rhythms for his people where they would have these feasts, the Feast of Purim and Passover, the Feast of Weeks. All of these, think in terms of, for us, like the holidays, Christmas, Easter, but these set times were a time of community and a time of celebration. This communal celebration of God's goodness, of God's provision. And so he built these rhythms into their calendar. Now, I know a lot of you are like me, where you hear this idea and you're like, well, I mean, okay. Like, it's not that I don't want to do that. I don't know that anybody's like, I want to be this busy. We want to slow down, but we feel like we can't because there's certain things that have to get taken care of, certain boxes that need to get checked. And look, this is why what we're really talking about here is pride. I have to be the one to do it. If I don't take care of this, it's not going to get taken care of. I can't trust God to handle this for me. I've got to be the one to handle it. And we think we can't slow down. We can't live with these rhythms of rest because we've bought into this prideful idea that it all depends on me. In Leviticus chapter 20, God addresses this. So he says to his people that he wants them on the seventh year to let the land rest. No farming on the seventh year, to let the land rest on the seventh year. For an agricultural society, this was impossible. That's how it would have felt to them. Like, okay, if we do that, we won't eat. We can't just not farm on the seventh year. We can't just let the land rest on the seventh year. God anticipates how counterintuitive this command of letting the land rest really was. And so he says, verse 20, you may ask, what will we eat in the seventh year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to ask, God. Like, what are we supposed to eat if we do things your way? Verse 21, I will send you such a blessing in the sixth year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. While you plant during the 8th year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat from it until the harvest of the 9th year comes in. God says, look, you honor me with this, I'll take care of things. You show that you're going to humbly be dependent on me by obeying what I ask, and I'll make up for it. I'll take care of it. I know it doesn't make sense on paper. I know scientifically you won't be able to really explain it, but I made everything, so I got it. And in this sense, resting and giving, resting and generosity are in step with each other. Where God asks us to do something that just feels impossible. Like we look at it on paper and we say, yeah, that's not going to work. The numbers don't make sense. My calendar can't work this way. This isn't going to work. And God says, look, this is a test. You trust me enough to do what I'm asking you, and I'll take care of things. Because ultimately, rest is an expression of how much we trust God. It's an expression of humility. It's our way of saying, God, I believe in you enough. I have enough faith in you that I'm going to do what you've asked me to do here, even though it seems impossible. And Jesus modeled this beautifully. Mark chapter 1. The entire town had gathered outside the home where Jesus was staying. They all had expectations for him. They kind of planned his calendar for him. And the Bible says in Mark 1 that very early in the morning that day, while it was still dark, that Jesus had got up and he had left the house and he went off to a solitary place where he prayed. And here's what happens. He comes back. All these people have his calendar planned. They have their expectations. And Jesus says, actually, that's not what we're going to do. I'm going to go to this other town. I'm going to preach at this other town. Why? Because he had spent time alone with God, and he was not living for other people's expectations. He wasn't going to have that pressure determine how he was going to spend his time, but he was going to live his life the way that God directed him. But that took time. Like, it meant getting up early. It meant going to a quiet place. It meant spending time in prayer. And if Jesus was humble enough to do that, then we should be too. Let me take you back 25 years ago, almost. I was living out here working to start this church. I was like 23, maybe 24 years old. I had no idea what I was doing. I was overwhelmed with some of the pressure and stress of that, working long hours. My wife would be like, you got to take a day off. And I'd be like, I can't. We were doing like 5 services on Sunday morning in the movie theaters. And I was having a hard time sleeping. And so I started taking sleeping pills at night. And then one night when this church was about a year old, I woke up in the middle of the night with this will sound strange, but with this sense that God was laughing at me, which is not what you want, right? Like, you don't want to wake up and feel like God is laughing at you, but that's what it seemed like. Maybe it was the sleeping pills, could have been, but it just felt very real to me. I woke up and felt like God was laughing at me, and I just couldn't quite figure out or understand that. And then some years later, I want to say it might have been like 7 years later, we were moving from one house into another, and I had saved like the heaviest piece of furniture for last. It was a desk in my office, and I flipped the desk over on its top, and I was sliding it across the floor. It was heavy. I was pushing with everything I had. I was getting it, but it was heavy. My son's like 4 years old at the time, and he comes up in between my arms, and he wants to help me. And so he starts pushing on that desk. Age 4, he's like parallel with the ground. He's giving it everything he's got. And we're together, right? We're together pushing the desk across the floor. But at some point, he just gets a little frustrated, a little annoyed with me. And he looks up at me while he's pushing this. He looks up at me and he says, "Dad, you're in my way." And I step back. And you know what I do as a father, as I look at my son who thinks he's pushing the desk? I laugh. And in that moment, it brought me back to the middle of the night, this sense of God laughing at me, not being mean or cruel, not pointing a finger, but like a father with a son who looks at his son and the son thinks he's pushing the desk. I wasn't pushing the desk. God was the one who was making it happen. God was the one who was pushing the desk. In my pride, I felt like I got to give this everything I've got, and I didn't have that much time for God because I'm doing the work of God, and God, you're in my way. I've got this. God was the one who was pushing the desk. When we rest, what we're doing is we're saying, God, it's you. It's all you. It's by your strength. It's by your power. It's by your might. God, it's you. And so that's really the invitation of this message, is to connect to his strength. Some of you will notice that this sermon doesn't have a list of things for you to do. I know people who are busy, there's a strange dynamic, like you listen to a sermon like this and you're waiting for me to tell you, here's what you need to do so you won't be so busy doing things, right? It's not the invitation. The invitation is to abide in Jesus, to stay connected to him. It's out of John 15, verse 5, where Jesus says to his disciples, on the night he would be crucified, he says to them, I'm the vine, you're the branches. If you remain in me and I remain in you, you'll bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can't do anything. He doesn't give them a long list of things they need to do. He doesn't give them a 5-year plan or strategic goals. He says, look, you remain in me. You be the branch. I'll be the vine. You remember where your help comes from. And when we live life with this rhythm of rest, we are humbly declaring our dependence on God and recognizing, I can't. He can. I think I'll let him. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your grace in this, that the pressure can come off and we can look to you as our source of strength and provision. I thank you that your yoke is easy, your burden is light. I pray, God, that you would allow us to experience true rest in you, that even as we worship here, even as we prepare to take communion, it would be an expression of these things, that we would just be declaring that you are the one who saved us, and you're the one who made us right, and you're the one who moves the desk. Our hope, our confidence, our faith is in you alone. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.